villa, who will eventually commit suicide after being implicated in the murder of Tiberius's son, and his brother Claudius, a stammering idiot who everyone knew would never amount to anything. While Augustus was dealing with his internal family dramas, an external disaster shook the regime right down to its core. Over the years, between the campaigns of Drusus and the subsequent campaigns of Tiberius, the Roman grip on Germania had slowly tightened. By 7 AD, the Romans were moving with relative impunity through the country and had established alliances with numerous Germanic tribes. Bases and forts had been erected on the far side of the Rhine, and, by all accounts, it was looking like Germania would soon be formally annexed. The only problem was that despite the appearance of goodwill and friendship, the majority of German tribes had no love for Rome whatsoever, and were not going to sit by while their country was enveloped into the empire. Into this dynamic stepped two men: Publius Quintilius Varus, then governor assigned to the task of consolidating Roman control of the country, and a German chieftain known by his Latinized name, Arminius. Arminius was well trusted by the Romans and played the part of a staunch Roman ally to the hilt. He had served in the legions, leading German auxiliary forces in numerous battles, and had even been granted citizenship for his service. Varus trusted the German leader implicitly and considered him a key to bringing the Germans in line with Roman rule. But despite outward appearances, Arminius hated the Romans. His real dream was not helping Rome conquer Germania, but rather uniting the independent German tribes under his single banner and leading them to victory against the legions. For 2 years, he ostensibly advised and aided Varus in his labors, but secretly was organizing a massive resistance effort. By 9 AD, Arminius had convinced enough of his countrymen to join him that he felt strong enough to strike. But being strong enough to strike did not mean simply declaring his break from Rome and attacking in a set-piece battle. No, that would never work. The German chieftain knew from his years of serving in the legions that his fellow tribesmen were no match for Rome's armies, all things being equal. So he set about making sure that all things would not be equal. He devised a trap for the Romans, and then leveraged his influence with Varus to make sure that the Roman leader walked right into it. Arminius was so trusted, in fact, that even when evidence of his intentions was brought to Varus's attention, the Roman general dismissed it as slander. But it wasn't slander. It was the truth. The trap was set for September, just as the weather was turning sour and the Romans were thinking more about holding up for the winter than dealing with a massive Germanic uprising. Arminius brought word to Varus that a revolt had broken out northwest of the main Roman camp, and that it would be best to go in with a show of force and remind the locals that their new rulers did not tolerate insurrection. So Varus led the 3 legions under his command, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, out of the camp, marching them northwest towards the alleged revolt. But of course, there was no uprising. Using the excuse that he was leaving to go raise more local soldiers to help Rome quell the unrest, Arminius left the Roman camp, met up with the massive army waiting to ambush the marching Romans in the Teutoburg forest. Completely unaware that anything was amiss, and believing himself far from any trouble, Varus marched his men in sloppy fashion. He declined to send out any advance scouts and allowed thousands of camp followers with their slow-moving baggage trains to travel alongside his forces. Believing his men to be in no danger, Varus also neglected to march in battle-ready order. Arminius had pointed them down a narrow and muddy road, and with heavy rain starting up, the going was slow. At a location that archaeologists have identified as just northeast of modern Osnabrück, the legions were forced to pass through a narrow strip of land, cutting between a sharp hill to the south and marshland to the north. I have a map posted of what the likely site looked like that was based on a map posted by Jona Lendering of Livius.org, whose careful analysis of the battle forms the basis for most of my own recounting of the disaster. At the narrow pass, Arminius waited to ambush the Romans. The Germans had fortified a position along the slope of the southern hill, and after allowing a good portion of the Roman train to pass, launched an assault on the middle of the Roman army. Varus and his men were taken totally unaware. The army was cut in half and suffered heavy losses. An attempt was made to storm the fortified wall the Germans had erected, but to no avail. The lead group, with the Germans now behind them, either escaped or were themselves annihilated after being forced into the marshland. The other group, with Varus still in command, fought their way out of the trap and managed to build a camp just west of the ambush site. After spending a sleepless night holed up behind their hastily erected fortifications, the remaining Romans broke out the next morning and headed southwest. But having to fight their way through hordes of German tribesmen, the breakout caused significant casualties. Between the initial ambush and the morning breakout, the 3 legions of Varus were, by this time, essentially destroyed. No longer were they an army fighting a battle. These were survivors fighting to escape. Varus led his men southwest, probably trying to make for a Roman base situated upon the Lipa River, but they would never make it. Between the heavy woods and the heavy rains, the Romans were unable to use their archers, unable to even hold up their waterlogged shields. Arminius sent a force ahead of Varus, and the confused Romans were ambushed for a second time. Surrounded, Varus recognized that continued fighting was hopeless. The Roman governor, along with most of his remaining officers, committed suicide. Some Roman soldiers were able to slip away from these repeated ambushes and make their way to the fortress along the Lipa, but they were an insignificant minority of those who had set out with Varus in search of a non-existent revolt just days before. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, plus accompanying cavalry and auxiliary troops, all told accounting for some 20,000. The battle in the Teutoburg Forest is widely recognized as one of those earth-shattering events that alters the course of history. Perhaps in constructing a narrative about why the Romans settled on the Rhine as their chosen frontier, historians have allowed the battle to take on outsized importance. But there is no doubt that it was a monumental disaster for Rome. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, for example, pass now from the historical record. Their numbers never again used by any future legions, sort of like retiring the number of a beloved sports hero. Augustus was reported to have stopped shaving for months after news of the massacre reached Rome, a traditional step in the Roman mourning process. For the rest of his life, Augustus is also reported to periodically and without warning shout, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Whether there was a one-to-one relation between the battle and the cession of permanent expansion into Germania or not, the two events coincide so neatly that the formation of a legend was inevitable. 19th century German nationalists made a hero of Arminius, calling him by his German name Hermann. They built statues to him and used the battle in the Teutoburg as proof of their racist superiority over the decadent Latins they had easily defeated. In concluding his article on the battle, Jona Lendering also points out that if the slaughter in the Teutoburg did indeed cause the Romans to abandon Germany, then Arminius deserves credit for the remaining existence of both the German and English languages, both of which would have been overwhelmed by Latin had the Romans successfully annexed Germania, just as the local dialects in France and Spain were supplanted. Whether fully justified or not, the battle in the Teutoburg Forest is one of those major mileposts along the road of Roman history, and it will definitely be on the test. Now, obviously, the Romans were not ones to simply tuck tail and run. So in the aftermath of the disaster, Augustus sent Tiberius to the Rhineland to execute punitive expeditions against the Germans. Tiberius would spend the next few years marauding around the countryside, laying waste to settlements and enslaving the natives. But there was no more interest shown in establishing permanent outposts east of the Rhine. Tiberius himself, when he became emperor, never pushed for any substantial war-making in Germania, Germanicus's campaigns notwithstanding. It is likely that in the final calculation, the Romans realized that the only thing capable of unifying the disparate German tribes into a force that could actually threaten the empire was the presence of the Romans on their land. By remaining west of the Rhine, the Romans gave the Germans no cause to abandon their eternal squabbling. In fact, the breakdown of German unity happened almost immediately after their greatest victory over Rome. After the Romans withdrew, Arminius sent the head of Varus to a rival chieftain to prove that together the Romans would not stand a chance against the tribes of Germania. But the rival leader simply passed the head along to Rome for burial, suspecting that Arminius was trying to make himself king and seeing no reason to allow such a thing to happen. Self-interest trumping all. Lacking unity, the Germans could no longer threaten Rome. But just to be careful, 8 full legions were forever stationed up and down the Rhine. These troops would guard the new frontier for hundreds of years, keeping Rome safe from the unconquered barbarians in Germania. There will be no episode next week, as I'll be traveling around for Memorial Day weekend. Unfortunately, the Mets blew up Randy Johnson yesterday, so he won't be going for his 300th win next Friday in Seattle, but I'll be at Safeco anyway, basking in the fading glow of the greatest left-handed pitcher in baseball history. We'll return in 2 weeks to follow Augustus's last great test, transferring power to Tiberius. Many believed that when Augustus died, the regime would die with him. But the old princeps arranged things as best he could to ensure that this wouldn't happen. The transition of power from Augustus to Tiberius was fraught with danger, but in the end, it would be pulled off without a hitch. Imperial Rome was off and running.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 56, The King is Dead, Long Live the King. Last time, we left Augustus reeling from the shocking annihilation of 3 legions in the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. The princeps, who was now over 70, never really recovered from the blow. The self-assuredness that had marked the regime from the beginning, a more tempered version of the audacious swagger that young Octavian had displayed, now shifted into something more cautious, more uneasy, and more paranoid. It was not just the defeat in Germania that caused the change in tone. Augustus was getting on in years, and found himself handing off more and more of the day-to-day routine of empire to Tiberius, who, as we will see, was nothing if not cautious, uneasy, and paranoid. But Tiberius's influence aside, there is no doubt that the disaster in the Teutoburg Forest affected Augustus mightily. It was the first time the fates had conspired to deny the princeps what he really wanted, in this case, the full annexation of Germania. He had dealt with setbacks and disappointments and betrayals before, and perhaps a younger Augustus would have raised more troops and conquered Germania just to prove to them who was in charge. But now, he took the defeat as a sign from the gods that he was overreaching, that he asked for too much, and that it was time to pull back. Twilight was settling in on the emperor, and he knew it. After the loss in Germania, Augustus stopped thinking about expansion, and stopped thinking altogether, really, about initiating new projects. The time had come to shore up the regime, secure his legacy, and make sure that when he finally, inevitably died, that the empire would not slip into chaos. Looking out over Rome, Augustus could at least be content in the knowledge that his legacy would not be that hard to secure. Every street in the capital, and every city in the provinces had been touched by his policies, his reforms, and his vision for the future of the empire. Famously announcing on his deathbed that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, Augustus was speaking both literally and metaphorically. Literally, his building projects had replaced many of the old crumbling facades around the city, ancient Rome. Augustus also left in his wake a slew of temples, baths, palaces, and aqueducts, all built in an attempt to turn the city, which was now, after all, the capital of the known world, into something that at least resembled its status. A great many of the projects, in particular a new line of aqueducts that delivered fresh water in abundance to the filthy, teeming masses, were spearheaded by Agrippa, who was not just Augustus's leader on the battlefield, but also something like his chief urban planner. At one point, Agrippa even took a step backwards on the cursus honorum, a thing not often done, just to take the office of city aedile, which